Let's move on to cellular respiration. So now that you have an idea what the organelles are and their functions, hopefully, let's talk about how the cell actually makes energy. So let's say, the mitochondria. At this point, all you know is that it is responsible for energy production. Well, we have to make that energy so that the cell can carry out all of the metabolic functions that it possibly can. So we need energy. We need to make energy that the cell can use. So it has to be converted. That energy ultimately comes from the sun, but then it has to be converted into a form of chemical energy that the cell can use. So we're going to be looking at how this occurs in eukaryotic cells. So cellular respiration occurs in both plant and animal cells, but I'll use the animal cell as our model as we go through this. So animals have to constantly get energy from food. So we have to keep eating. We have to eat every day so that we can make the specific energy molecule called ATP. So looking at how photosynthesis and cellular respiration work together, how plants and animals work together. So plants giving off oxygen, this is probably bringing you back to elementary school or middle school, and we're taking in carbon dioxide, we're giving off carbon dioxide so that the plants can use it to formulate their own food. So it's how all these processes work together. So again, ultimately we get our energy from the sun, but we have to then either eat plants or other animals to get that energy and then convert it to ATP. So there's an intermediate step for animals. So aerobic harvesting of energy. So aerobic means that oxygen is present. So that's an important term for you to know. So aerobic, oxygen is present. So just to give you an overview, and then we'll look at the nitty-gritty steps of cellular respiration. So the ultimate source of energy is glucose. You've seen that before, heard that before in the last unit. So glucose is the sugar of life. Not the spice of life, but the sugar of life. That's broken down then, and the products are carbon dioxide and water. That's what we give off through cellular respiration. So glucose is where we get our energy. So if we start with glucose and oxygen, as shown down here, those go through an extremely complex series of chemical reactions to then get out the carbon dioxide, water, and ultimately the ATP. This is what we're really interested in, is producing this adenosine triphosphate molecule. Adenosine triphosphate. So this all happens, or mainly happens, in the mitochondria. Most of cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. And we get about 36 molecules of ATP out in the end from just one glucose molecule. So it's pretty extraordinary. Now this varies. This is an average. It completely depends on the person. Some people, might produce as little as 28, and others can produce up to 40. So we're looking at an average. For most people, it's around 36 for the net ATP molecule. So some ATP has to be used in this process. So it's kind of like, how you have to invest some money into a company to make money. Same idea. You have to invest some energy to then have a great production of energy out at the end. So 36 ATP is the net number of molecules. So ATP, what the heck is that molecule? Here's the molecule, what it looks like. You will not have to memorize its structure, although it is pretty cool. So we have this adenosine right here. Ribose, that should look familiar. Ribose is also found in RNA. And then we have 3 phosphate groups, hence the triphosphate. So phosphate is a PO4. So just to show you that it is indeed this molecule, it's not just these 3 letters stuck together and we're saying that's energy. It is this special molecule that helps us do all of the metabolic functions in the body. So adenosine triphosphate. So here are the stages of cellular respiration. So there's 3 stages, none of which lack complexity, that's for sure. We are going to try to keep it a little more simplistic for this class. So the first stage, glycolysis, that is anaerobic process. That means that it is void of oxygen. No oxygen is involved. Then the second 2 stages, does that make sense? The next 2, citric acid cycle, sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle, it's kind of the old name for it, but that's the dude that discovered it. So the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, those 2 stages are called aerobic. And it's a little bit misleading because oxygen is actually only used in the 3rd stage. But oxygen has to be present in the cell for the 2nd stage to start. So oxygen is used in the 3rd stage, but it has to be present in the cell for the 2nd stage to start. So that's a little bit misleading when you say both of those are aerobic. It means, oh, well, that means we need oxygen. Yes, for the 2nd stage it's indirect, and 3rd stage it's directly. So let's take a peek-a-boo at the first stage of cellular respiration. Now, I do want to point out this is different than breathing respiration. You think of breathing in and out. Not the same thing. Although it's the exchange of gases, you think, well, I'm taking in oxygen, I'm blowing out carbon dioxide, but that is different. This is what's occurring in all of the cells. And then ultimately what happens is when you breathe in that oxygen, it goes to all the cells into the body. The blood carries it there. Cellular respiration happens, and then all the carbon dioxide from the cells are collected, transported back to the lungs, and then you can puff them out. Puff out the carbon dioxide, okay? So it's different. This is what's occurring in every cell. So let's look at this first stage. We're starting with a molecule of glucose. This is where we need a little bit of energy. 2 ATP molecules need to come in, kind of kick it in the pants, so that it splits in 2. So glucose, which is 6 carbons, will split into 2 molecules, each having 3 carbons. So it splits in half. Now this little P here with the I, that is a phosphate group. Phosphate group. Remember we saw that on adenosine triphosphate. ATP has 3 phosphate groups. So these newly formed molecules are called pyruvate. Okay, you'll see that down here, pyruvate. The other thing that is needed during this stage, we need the 2 ATP, but we also need this NAD+. NAD+, that is an ion. NAD+ is an ion. Has a big old honkin' name just like all the others. So we're just going to abbreviate NAD+. That is going to glob onto a hydrogen. So we're generating this special molecule. This NADH is a special molecule that is used for carrying electrons, and the electrons become extremely important in the very last stage of cellular respiration. So now notice though, we use 2 ATP molecules in the first step to split glucose, but then when we go to this step right here, 2 ATP molecules are produced in forming pyruvate on this side, and 2 of them are formed on this side. So we used 2 ATP molecules, but we produced a total of 4. So our net ATP for glycolysis is 2 ATPs. You use 2, you produce 4, so the net is 2. Alright, so now we got 2 pyruvates. Ooh, I do have a quick animation for you. So here's to give you essentially the word version of what you just saw. So glycolysis begins cellular respiration. Oh, what I didn't mention though, it takes place in the cytoplasm. The first stage of cellular respiration is in the cytoplasm. Now we're going to take those pyruvate molecules, dink around with them a little bit to get into the next stage. Here we go. So here we start with the pyruvate or pyruvic acid. So don't confuse those. Think of them as one and the same, okay, even though they're kind of not, but think of them as one and the same, pyruvic acid or pyruvate. So this sucker gets split down even more. So what happens is one of the carbons is lopped off and actually is then a byproduct of cellular respiration in the form of carbon dioxide. So, important points. Carbon dioxide is given off when pyruvic acid or pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA. So then you get carbon dioxide given off when pyruvic acid is transformed into the acetyl-CoA. Now we go into the citric acid cycle. This cycle is in the mitochondria. So the acetyl-CoA goes into the mitochondria and goes into this cycle. Now if you look at what's needed for this, you have the 3 NAD pluses, that ion, same with FAD. These guys come on in and start picking up these hydrogens. So it produces NADH, FADH2, and some more carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a major byproduct of the citric acid cycle. So it's not part that we need, it's just we slough it off. And that's what we breathe out. It's a waste product of cellular respiration. The other thing that's formed is ATP. So during the citric acid cycle, we get NADH, FADH2, and ATP. Those are the 3 molecules that we really want. And actually, citric acid cycle produces 2 ATP, just like glycolysis, or the net of glycolysis. The whole point of the citric acid cycle is generating these electron carrier molecules, the FADH2 and the NADH. We want to get tons of these guys because they become very important in the 3rd cycle that generates the majority of the ATP. So, the major goal of the citric acid cycle is to produce NADH and FADH2. And we get just 2 ATP molecules coming off there. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. And remember, a waste product is carbon dioxide. This takes place in the mitochondria and starts with that acetyl-CoA, which is formed from pyruvic acid. The oxidation of glucose continues in the citric. So moving right along, remember that this takes place in the mitochondria and it's the acetyl-CoA that enters into the mitochondria. Carbon dioxide is produced right at the formation of the acetyl-CoA and then also during the citric acid cycle. The overall goal, supplying the 3rd stage with electrons, with energy. So here's the overall yield per glucose, remember. So going all the way back to the beginning of cellular respiration, this is still from 1 glucose molecule. Okay, 3rd stage, and by far the most complex, but we'll try to keep it simplistic for you. Now this is where all of those NADHs and FADH2 is going to be used. So if you can see them right here, and their whole purpose is to generate tons of these hydrogen ions. Now the hydrogen ions then are also going to join up with oxygen. This is where oxygen actually gets used, and water is then a waste product. So this is where the bulk of ATP is actually made. And it's because of those electron carrier molecules, they're holding all that energy that's been gained so far. And so it's all going to be synthesized or released at this stage to produce the ATP. So that this is adenosine diphosphate, so di means two phosphate groups, globs onto another phosphate group to produce ATP. So this is where the max amount of ATP is generated.
The oxidation of glucose continues in the citric acid cycle. Pyruvate molecules formed during glycolysis.
Other stages. Alright, so this is again hopefully spelling out for you what exactly is occurring during that last stage of oxidative phosphorylation. So generating all of those hydrogen ions that then can go through that particular protein, that ATP synthase, and ultimately producing the bulk of the ATP. Now, what happens if there's no oxygen present, which can happen? So let's say you're running and then you're out of breath, so you're not taking in enough oxygen to meet the demands of your cells. So if you're running, they're going to have to really crank out a lot of ATP. So they need a lot of oxygen for that to occur. So if your body cannot produce enough ATP, and it does, and because of that, the source of that is because you're not taking in enough oxygen. So if you don't have enough oxygen, your body goes into what's called anaerobic respiration. So remember, anaerobic means that there is no oxygen, void of oxygen. And it is called lactic acid fermentation. So the cells actually undergo some fermentation. And this occurs right after the production of pyruvate. So remember, the first stage is anaerobic, so therefore it can start the process without oxygen. So once those pyruvate are formed, then your cells do a shout out of, hey, do we have oxygen present, so that we can make the acetyl-CoA and go into the citric acid cycle. If the cell shouts back, no, we don't have any oxygen, then it's like, okay, we got to go to plan B. So the pyruvate undergoes fermentation to produce lactate, which then it forms lactic acid. And the whole reason why it does this is to generate a whole bunch of this NAD+, because it is needed to split glucose. And so your body is relying on the first stage, glycolysis, which only produces 2 ATP, but that's its only option. So it's going to produce this lactic acid so that it can generate more NAD+, and therefore produce more ATP, but it's just the 2 ATP for every glucose molecule. So it's still not a whole heck of a lot. So your body luckily has a check for you where it's like, okay, if you're running, you're out of breath, and all of a sudden your muscles cramp up, you can't breathe very well, that is your body saying, hey dummy, stop running because we can't produce enough ATP to keep up with you. So your body will physically make you stop. Your brain will say you must stop or you will die. Once we don't have enough ATP in your cells, you die. So I guess you could potentially run yourself to death if you could somehow overwrite your brain. So the lactic acid fermentation, if you've ever heard of lactic acid buildup in the muscles, so that's when the muscles will cramp, again forcing you to stop running, because you don't want all that lactic acid in your muscles. So lactic acid fermentation, this occurs in animals for organisms. This does not happen in plants. Plants go through a different type of fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation only occurs in animals. So now, again, this is what happens during glycolysis. So we start with glucose, and then we go to pyruvate. If there's no oxygen present, instead of forming acetyl-CoA, we form lactic acid. And just a tiny bit of ATP, but your body, again, is having to rely on that small amount. So if this occurs in plant cells, okay, so, or in yeast, I should say, I'm sorry, not necessarily plants, we're not going through, if you look at like a fungus, yeast are the classic example because we like to ferment them and drink the fermented fruits. So now we're starting with the pyruvic acid, but now we are forming ethanol instead of lactic acid. So ethanol is a byproduct. Really interesting tidbit. There is a condition where some people have a lot of yeast in their gut, and their guts, or not their guts, but when they eat and they're digesting their food, it starts fermenting, and they get drunk just from eating. So they have a really high alcohol level when they haven't consumed any alcohol. And that's from the fermentation of the yeast in their guts. Not great for the liver.
Some cells are able to synthesize ATP via the process of glycolysis. In many cells, if oxygen is not present, pyruvate is metabolized in a process called fermentation. By oxidizing the NADH produced in glycolysis, fermentation regenerates NAD+, which can take part in glycolysis once again to produce more ATP. The net energy gain in fermentation is 2 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose. Fermentation complements glycolysis and makes it possible for ATP to be continually produced in the absence of oxygen. There are two types of fermentation. Alcohol fermentation, which occurs in yeast, results in the production of ethanol and carbon dioxide. Lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in muscle, results in the production of lactate.
All right, so let's do a quick review. Remember that aerobic respiration requires oxygen. That's what our cells prefer to go through because that will produce the most ATP. The majority of cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria with the exception of the first step, which is glycolysis. That occurs in the cytoplasm. Roughly 36 ATP molecules are produced at the very end, the net of ATP. And here's our formula. Make sure you know the formula for aerobic respiration and the names of this. You'll be able to recognize a glucose molecule, an oxygen molecule, carbon dioxide. You don't have to recognize the ATP. If I were to write that whole thing out, it's a big old ugly molecule. So we will just keep it as ATP, but recognize that that is the energy molecule for the body. Okay, so here's our glucose. And it undergoes glycolysis, so glucose is going to split. Sorry, that happens in the cytoplasm, produces a net of 2 ATP. This glucose will split into pyruvate, which will then be reduced down to acetyl-CoA, those carbon atoms anyway, and then go into the Krebs cycle, which produces 2 ATP. And then this generates all of that NADH plus and FADH2, which are the electron carrier molecules. That's what's super important to go into the electron transport chain, which then produces roughly 32 ATP. This is where the debate is how much ATP is produced during the electron transport chain. Oh, and there's our mitochondria. Oh, and the other piece of this, the electron transport chain or the oxidative phosphorylation, that all takes place in the membrane of the mitochondria.